This is University Lecture. Welcome to another in a series of lectures given on the campus of Iowa State University in Ames. Today, the concluding half of a lecture given by Dr. Max Rafferty. The speech was recorded at this year's VISHA activities at Iowa State and is the third in a series of programs from VISHA 1971. On today's program, we will hear the question and answer period which followed Mr. Rafferty's address. The program begins with his concluding remarks.
And after all, in closing, let me address just a final appeal to you students who are here today. For Pete's sake, resolve among yourselves never to surrender to the greatest enemy you have in the generation which lies ahead. And it's not any of the things you've been thinking of. It's not a dying Vietnam War which will wind itself up within the next 16 months. It's not an ecology which stems from something else. It's not the H-bomb. It's not even civil rights. These things all have a major cause and stem from one common fountainhead of enmity. Your greatest enemy, surprisingly and laughably, is Mr. Stork. And you'd better believe it. Resolve among yourselves never to surrender to your greatest enemy, the sheer, blind, deadening weight of numbers. Because uniquely among all generations that have come, this is the enemy with whom at last you have come grimly to grips. And the tragic part of it is that on campus after campus, where the leadership of the future should be springing up, this is the last enemy who is realized. Not so much in this country, where the birth rate at least has reached a temporary trough, but in Asia, in Africa, in South America, bulging and burgeoning at the seams. In 40 years, the population of this planet will double unless something is done. Just because mankind, however, is breeding in a terrific explosion of population, don't sit back in your several little groups and wait numbly and happily for inevitable tragedy to overtake you. It may well be that the great contribution which your America has yet to make in its cycle of universal history will be the solution to this one crucial problem, the survival of the individual, precious and unique in a world of constantly multiplying billions. Surely in the hammering out of a mighty issue such as this one, there's a vital role for each American to play. College student or racial minority member, educator or non-educator, businessman or trade unionist. A role which each of us must act out and hopefully add to until the time comes for us to leave the stage to those who will come after us and will inherit what we leave them. For tomorrow will come in one way or another, make no mistake about it. It has a nasty habit of doing that. Make no mistake, it's going to be up to us, and particularly to you who come upon the stage as some of us are about to leave it, as individual citizens of the country which I have said is at once the hope and the envy of the human race, to determine whether at the on-surging and billowing wave of the future, mankind is going to hear the laughter and the shouting of free men or the murmuring of innumerable bees. Yeah, while we're getting to the mic, just two ground rules for the sake of our collective sanity. First of all, try to limit your questions to some field of the general area of education, which is the only area in which I claim any expertise at all. If you were to ask me something about Etruscan tomb carving, for example, I would be helpless. And secondly, will the questions please be questions? I'm sorry, sir, it's a little difficult here because of the people moving in and out. Go right ahead.
You mentioned that the Stork was our biggest enemy, and my question is, do you really think that we can do anything about the population problem in the rest of the world before we control our own?
Good question, sir. He wants to know whether we can do anything about the population of the rest of the world before we control our own. Well, some interesting things started to happen, sir, about 7 years ago. Our demographic projections in Sacramento, where I had my state offices, indicated that by the school year 1974-75, the number of children in California schools would be less than it was the year before. This, incidentally, is the first time that will ever have happened since California became a state. A trough in the birth rate started to develop about 1964-65. It is currently going through the lower schools, and not only in California and the other large states such as New York, but as far as I know in all states, with the possible exception of a few like Arizona and Florida, where there has been a mass migration of people from other states which have artificially made up the lack, or the lag. Right now, the question is what you people are going to do, and I can't put it any more simply than that. If the population is to be controlled, it will have to be controlled by you. The group that just preceded you, the generation of the 50s and the 60s, apparently now has decided to try to limit families, say to 2 children, and that's what's causing the current lag in the growth rate. If this continues, this country will at least level off at its present population peak, even as one of the other great countries of the world, through its own efforts, has leveled off its population completely in the last decade. And I'm speaking, of course, of the country of Japan, where the effort has been successful, although the means have been somewhat draconic. Now, the gentleman wants to know, can we help other countries if we cannot help ourselves? The answer is, sir, possibly, but not certainly. The best help we could give other countries would be the help which Japan has given, an example of voluntary control. But if we cannot do this completely, we can at least make available to other countries the one thing which we have to export and which we have not exported successfully to date, and that is education. Guns we have exported, atom bombs we have exported, Coca-Cola we have exported by the millions of tons. But education, except for a few efforts of the Peace Corps, has not been exported as a principal commodity of this country. Therefore, I would like to recommend to you all that you take an immediate and a personal interest in education, and particularly in education which teaches people what will happen if they do not control themselves. And this applies not only biologically, but emotionally. Next question. Yes? Would you go to the microphone, please? Incidentally, if you want to speak to me, just come up and stand in back of the mic, and I'll take on all comers here. Go ahead.
You said that the education philosophy...
That's not turned on, I'm afraid. You know, there is an essay entitled The Tyranny of Inanimate Objects. I think it was dedicated to public address systems. Why don't we take one more over here? Yes, sir. We'll get back to you, young lady.
In your last editorial in the Daily, you talked about the Navy. And in this speech today, you've been stressing individuality very, very strongly. And for somebody like you, I can't see how you could get so uptight about something that seems to me to be as trivial as long hair and beards.
One reason is professional, the other is personal. Let me explain. First of all, I've been a high school teacher, vice principal, and principal a great part of my life. And I have found as a matter of sheer survival at an administrative capacity in a typical high school that I have to be able to tell at a glance, from the rear too, whether a person who is entering a restroom marked girls is actually a girl. Secondly, from a personal standpoint, I find in Shakespeare's words that it is easiest for me to find the mind's construction in the face. I have always liked to look people in the face and to read their expressions, and to try to interpret their personalities, and the contours and expressions which go like a kaleidoscope across the face of every normal human being. And I find, strictly from a personal standpoint, that the whisk broom effect simply bars me off from one of my favorite pastimes, looking and speaking and talking and reading the mind's construction in the face. Next question.
Dr. Rafferty,
Yes, do we have a mic over here now?
I think,
Oh, I beg your pardon.
I just wanted to make one more
I'm
comment.
sorry, I have a trouble finding where these mics are coming from.
I think probably Shakespeare had hair that's longer than most of the people here, too.
Surely, sir, although I know you don't intend to, you did not mean to be unkind. To compare a poor, lowly dean of education, than which there is nothing lower, really, to the greatest mind of modern Western Europe, a man who could read the mind's construction and even the movement of a fingertip, is hardly to reach a fair analogy. I do not claim to be Shakespeare. I merely claim to be me. I do not claim to have Shakespeare's opinions. I merely claim to articulate my own, and my own are precisely what I have just told you. Next question.
Well, I'd like to ask you about your philosophy of education, about the individualism. And it seemed to me that the end point of this idea of individualism which you had was sort of to perpetuate the economic hierarchy, which seems to me to be the major problem in the United States today. And I was wondering if rather than building up individuality in people, though I think this is really fine, how also we can instill in people some sort of tolerance and humanity which will help them deal with these problems a little bit better. I think that's probably the major difficulty we have today.
First of all, I don't agree that the purpose of education, either consciously or unconsciously, is to perpetuate a certain economic hierarchy. If that had been the case of education, we would still be operating on the McKinley economic laissez-faire basis. We certainly are not. The American economic system has changed almost unrecognizably in the last half century, and I'm sure will change even more in the next 50 years. It may be that the educational system is not helping this along as rapidly as you'd like to see it, but our economic system has certainly changed tremendously, far more than it did in the previous 150 years. So I think there's hope there. Now, the young lady wants to know whether I don't think that instead of stressing individuality so much, although she agrees with that, I should be worrying about how to promote tolerance for people who are of other backgrounds and perhaps other colors. And I say to you precisely what I said in my original remarks. The best way to assure tolerance and fair play for all is to treat each person completely as an individual and not under a label. If we persist in thinking of people in groups, sects, or cliques with certain labels and certain colors or certain religions common to them, we're simply copping out. This is the easy way to treat problems, by saying, well, we're going to benefit a group. The group concept is an artificial one. There are no groups, really, of the kind the young lady is peripherally referring to. There are only large numbers of people like you and me. And when we start thinking, as John Stuart Mill said, in different terms, and start thinking about America instead of 200 million people, each belonging to a group of several million, we will be farther along the road toward mutual tolerance, understanding, yes, and kindliness than we have ever been before. And I honestly feel that this is true. Now,
Sir?
someone from over here. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Max, I've got a question. And I trust you're not offended by being on a first-name basis, because I do believe we are relating as individuals, although I found in the last question you talked to the crowd as a group rather than to the lady who asked the question. But I had one question after your speech was over, and that question is, do you really believe what you said? Because during your speech, I sat out there and I wanted to jump up and scream and stop you and question you on a number of points that you'd raised, but I felt the identity of the group holding me back, and maybe this is what you were talking to. But do you realize that if I would have jumped up in the middle of your speech and started questioning you, that would have distracted from the others who might not want to?
Certainly. The gentleman said if he jumped up and screamed in the middle of a speech, he would not only startle me, I would be alarmed for his own condition, and I'd probably stop and administer first aid. And therefore, of course, he did not do it. But if he is trying to imply that individualism consists of jumping up and down and screaming in the middle of someone's speech, I really have to draw a semantic line here. Individualism and individuality are far deeper and more profound than anything so superficial and so vocal. Next question from over here.
Well, I'd like to ask you again.
Oh, surely.
Something about this idea of the group. You said something about you didn't want the minds of the school children or the young to be molded by what they saw on TV, on the news. I wondered if you were referring to this group which you seem to lump us into a group, or lump whoever it is into a group, like the demonstrators in Washington and things like that. Can you yourself consider the demonstrators as individuals?
I consider everybody an individual. I'm not concerned with how I look at them. I'm concerned with how they look at themselves. And my job here today was not to persuade you to react in the way I would like to have you react, or to mold yourself in the preconception that I might hold. That's the last thing I have in mind. My job today was to try to get you to think in terms of individualism as to your own definition. I gave you a few as samples for you to jump up and down at if you like. As far as the demonstrators in Washington are concerned, I find that people who go around streets all doing the same thing, all mouthing the four-letter obscenities and all throwing the same rocks at the same people, are evidencing distressing uniformity and conformity. And I would hope that they would change as they grow older and more mature and learn to act for themselves. Yes, sir.
You spoke of individualism in the schools, yet you voted to fire Angela Davis from the University of California at Los Angeles because she was a communist. How can you justify this?
I can't if it were as you say. The fact is it wasn't as you say. Notice he added a qualifying phrase. He said you voted to fire Angela Davis because she was a communist. This is the farthest thing from my mind, and I can tell you what was in my mind at the moment. As a matter of fact, for about 3 months while this investigation was going on, I don't know what some of the other regents voted on. That was their business. But I voted as an individual, and I voted as a school administrator. I was the only one on the Board of Regents. When the Davis case came up, I had only one question, and the minutes will verify this. I asked for her scholastic and experience record as an instructor and as a student. I was the only one who did, as far as I know, and I got it. Now, if I have any area of expertise, it's in the area of hiring teachers. I've been doing it on and off for 30 years. And I looked at those papers, and I went over them with a fine-tooth comb. There were 52 people who applied for that particular assistant professorship in that particular field at UCLA. She was the last of the 52 I would have hired, not knowing anything about her because her papers were incredibly the lousiest. What's more, I found that she lied. When she filled out those papers, she said that she was within 1 or 2 semesters at the most of achieving the doctor's degree, which is a prerequisite for professorial positions at UCLA. And the fact was, she had not gone even near it. Her doctoral committee had not been appointed. She herself had not done her doctoral dissertation, and she had not even taken the comprehensive examination. She was a minimum of 2 years away with full-time work. And I have been in search of the elusive doctorate on my own hook in my day, and I know precisely what goes into it. No, I voted to fire the lady because A, she was obviously unqualified for the job, and B, she was demonstrably a liar. And over here.
Just Mr. Rafferty?
Excuse me, I thought you were finished.
The regents fired her the first time, and then the state Supreme Court said that they could not fire her because the regents had fired her because she was a communist, and you know that.
I'm sorry, sir.
They overturned the decision, and then you decided to fire her because she was not qualified, as you just stated.
I hate to correct you, sir, but unfortunately your facts are wrong. As Winston Churchill once said about something else, you're guilty of a terminological inexactitude. The fact is that a minor court accepted the petition of her lawyer for a temporary restraining order against the regents of the university. That court gave the restraining order and instructed the regents to prepare an appeal from it. They were doing this very thing at the time that she came up for renewal of contract, which was not granted, and a short time after that, she was on the lam as one of the FBI's 10 most wanted criminals. The Supreme Court never had anything to do with it. Next question.
Dr. Rafferty, I think the major problem with my understanding your speech today is that you failed to develop any kind of coherent theme because you had a lot of contradictions, is what I think. You speak in terms of individualism and self-choice, and at the same time you say that I, as a member of, say, an ethnic minority, say Scotch American, must give up any feeling of my ethnic culture and become the lowest common denominator of this American culture, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant.
Well, of course, I never mentioned any white Anglo-Saxon Protestants that I can recall, and I don't recall asking anybody to give up the great traditions, the culture, and the language that have come down to him from his own particular group. I specifically mentioned during the talk that I realized that we were all born into groups and that we all owe allegiance to groups. I mentioned your family, I mentioned your state, I mentioned the nation, I mentioned humanity, and said that we could not disregard this. My point is that when you let the group, whatever it is, become more important to you in your own personality development than yourself, then I think you have prostituted your own future to that of a beehive culture. My thoughts for you today are not for you to rebel against others, to commit acts of violence, or to disobey laws. My appeal to you today is something far more deep-seated than that. To stop thinking in terms of superficial issues and apparent problems, and to think in terms of yourself and what you are going to be able to do as an individual to help solve the problems of us all. To do this is not to traduce your families or indeed your family tree. It is to teach you to honor them insofar as they deserve being honored, but to develop your own future and not be the prisoners of a group of other people who may be using you for their own purposes. That's all. Yes.
Mr. Rafferty, I attend a system that, like a factory, demands that I take the same math, the same history, the same English as everyone else. Yet when I request that this be changed, you term this as irrelevant.
I did.
In one of your recent editorials.
I don't think I termed anything irrelevant. I haven't used the term in some time. Let me see what you're talking about. You're saying that in a school you have to take certain things in common with everybody else because there is considered to be a common body of material which is vital to every educated man. The assumption that I guess is being made here is that because you are compelled to do certain things you don't want to do and to take certain subjects that you don't want to do, this precludes you from acting as an individual. I strongly disagree. There are many majors that can be taken in any school. You have freedom of choice, at least after you get into high school, pretty much you do. There are plenty of variations within colleges and universities of things that you can take inside the same major. The fact that you're compelled by resolution, let's say, of a board of directors someplace to take certain things in college does not necessarily restrict your individuality. You still have sufficient individuality to go to some other college if you want, or go to none if that's what you want. More likely, if you're a real individual, you will master information, which the race considers essential to the development of the educated man, and use it in such a way as to enhance your own individualism and to make it possible for others to continue to enjoy theirs. I see no real contradiction. I have to travel below 70 miles an hour in my new state in my car because this is for the benefit of all. But this does not prevent me, I think, from behaving as an individual. If I wish to drive 90 in violation of the law, I do not think this would prove my individualism, only my enjoyment of license at the expense of others. Yes, sir.
I too was at Berkeley during the years 1964 to 68, and I had a different interpretation of the events that happened during those years than you did. But what I'd like to ask you is, given the set of circumstances which you spoke of, that is, everyone becoming a number and that sort of thing, given that was true, what is it that you would expect of the people to have done other than what happened?
I'm going to talk about the future, not the past. I'll tell you what I expect of you, sir. I expect you to limit your family to 2 children. I expect, secondly, that you will teach your children to grow up respecting the rights of others as individuals and determined to perpetuate their own rights as individuals and to think always in this life as being an individual with an own personality, with his own immortal soul, and not to surrender to the beehive philosophy which I discussed in my original remarks. I think if every person in the United States were to do this, we would be in no great problem from Mr. Stork in the future or from the conformity demanded by collectivism. But if we do not do this, we can expect a continuation of what we're seeing today. This is the advice I would have given your grandfathers, incidentally, although their problems were a little different. Now, I think we're getting on toward the end here. It's almost 1:30. Why don't we take 1 or 2 more, and then we'll knock it off. Yes?
Toward the end of your speech, you made a comment that above all other groups, we should be Americans first. My only question is, with your speech stressing so much on individuality, how can you say that we should be Americans above this?
I'm sorry that I didn't make myself clear, and I think this was my fault, undoubtedly, for not being sufficiently clear. An error which a speaker falls into when he becomes overly familiar with his own material. I hope that I had made the point in rather exhaustively that this country was founded by individualists. I said that many of them were rugged and some of them were a little peculiar. That American schools had always striven, up until our own time, for the individual and the individual competence and mastery of material. That the churches had striven to save individual souls. And so when I said American, I said it in that ancient and classical tradition, a nation which was set up for individuals. Not as we have perverted it perhaps in our own time, but as it was originally conceived, bright and shining as a refuge for individualists from all the corners of this distracted planet. And so when I say be an American first, I mean be an individualist first. The terms are synonymous to me. Yes?
This is a two-part question, and please don't cut me off after you answer the first. A doctor of education has quoted you as saying or writing that you would rather send one of your siblings to a whorehouse rather than Summerhill. Is that true? Well, I
didn't hear that too well, and I don't really get it. Would you mind saying it a little more slowly? The hearing is bad up here.
Okay. Doctor of Education has quoted you as saying or writing something to the fact that you rather send one of your siblings to a whorehouse rather than Summerhill. Is that correct?
Oh, no. What I said was, not that I would like to send one of mine. What I said was that I would as soon send anybody, enroll someone in Summerhill as I would enroll him in a brothel. Because Summerhill, like a brothel, is dedicated to immorality and practices it every day.
Yeah, that was the second part of my question. It seemed to stress, from reading the book, his ideals seemed to be stressing the individual, and the individual learning what you have said were the immortal truths, and letting him find these truths on it by himself rather than having them taught to them.
This is something you may not know anything about. He's talking about a school called Summerhill, which is an ultra-progressive school located in England, and that several books have been written on one of which I contributed along with many other people. I was asked my opinion of Summerhill, and I have to issue a caveat here. Distrust much of what I am about to say because, like all the other people who contributed to this critique, I have not been to Summerhill. I had to read the book and reach my opinions accordingly. And you should by all odds talk to someone who has been there, like the British Ministry of Education, who sent members there to study it for some period and came back with a very black report on it. But the gentleman is asking whether or not the stress on individualism at Summerhill is not indeed the kind of thing that I am praising, and therefore why do I criticize Summerhill if indeed I am an individualist? Let me give you the answer. The difference is that between an individualist and an exhibitionist. To put it in concrete terms, for those of you who have studied history and literature, it is the difference between Henry David Thoreau and Timothy Leary. Thoreau, you know, was the greatest American individualist and dissenter. He did it entirely intellectually. He did not believe, for example, that little children, babies, should be permitted to do everything in the world they wanted to. And I doubt if anyone in this audience thinks so either. You won't have your children around very long. They'll be dead. He did not believe that individualism consisted in letting children do everything in the world they wanted to. That way lies anarchy and mass ignorance. What he did believe was that by educating people and providing them with organized and disciplined subject matter, they could decide in their own minds whether or not they wanted to be individualists, and then he fought for their freedom to do so. I will conclude this part of this question with a little quotation from Thoreau, which some of you may not have heard. He was, of course, a nonconformist. He refused to pay his taxes because he disapproved of the Mexican War. Unlike our activists today, however, instead of enlisting expensive lawyers in the ACLU, he went down to Concord Jail and turned himself in, saying that he knew very well that he lived in a democratic society where the majority had to rule or there would be chaos, and since he found himself obliged to set himself against the will of his fellow people, he felt obliged to pay the penalty, and so he served his time in jail. The story is also told that Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was a dissenter of a somewhat more conventional type, came up hastily from Boston to visit his friend Thoreau in jail, and when Emerson, twirling his beaver hat and with his respectable cravat, saw Thoreau lounging in his cell behind the bars, presumably writing Walden, Emerson felt great distress. He tut-tutted, "Oh, Henry, Henry, what are you doing in there?" To which Thoreau, without even raising his eyes, replied, "Oh, Ralph, Ralph, what are you doing out there?" And in that, there is the whole difference between an exhibitionist and an individual. Thoreau was an individual par excellence. An exhibitionist, he was not. Summerhill is an exhibition and a dirty joke. Now, I don't want to prolong this indefinitely, but go ahead.
I'd like you to clear up an inconsistency in your talk. And that's, on the one hand, you said that there is a respect for the man who gets things done, and I firmly believe this. On the other hand, you're fostering an individualistic, do-your-own-thing philosophy, cutthroat, beat the other guy, possibly at the expense of getting things done. I think in some situations it's the group that can get things done better than the individual.
The gentleman says that by enunciating the nation's respect for men who get things done, I'm being inconsistent with my thesis of individualism. Because the man who gets things done automatically goes around cutting people's throat and competing at the cost of someone else. I decline to accept the premise, sir. I decline it on every ground, including that of logic. Our history is full of men, from Lincoln to Edison and millions in between and since, who have achieved magnificently, who have gotten things done in the finest sense of the word, and who have never stepped upon the toes of their fellow men. I'm not indulging in a return to laissez-faire economics. I don't want to go back to the sweatshops. That's the antithesis of individualism to me, because there, a few individuals exercise license at the expense of other individuals. I stand for the right of each individual, and I stand for the right not to be oppressed, and I decline the right to oppress others, whether that person is J.P. Morgan or Abby Hoffman.
Now, Dr. Rafferty, you certainly have championed the shibboleth of individuality. I'm certain that's nothing we can argue with. But don't you think there are certain concessions we have to make in the classroom? Don't you think that in the classroom situation, in the classroom context, there has to be a standardization? I mean, just the basis of communication is a commonality of experience. Don't you think we'll have a Tower of Babel situation? If everyone does their own thing, everyone talks differently, everyone thinks differently, don't you think that we have to think of the student in terms of a homogeneous group to a certain extent in the classroom?
Apparently, I am failing to make my point here, the difference between individualism and exhibitionism. An individualist, following Cardinal Newman's classic definition of a gentleman, is one who never willingly inflicts pain or discomfort upon others. The exhibitionist will do so as a matter of course. If anyone makes a Tower of Babel situation in a classroom, if some nut wanders into my class sporting an Iroquois scalp lock dyed deep purple, with hair reaching to his knees, with no shoes, no shirt, exuding a visible aura of unwashed disinhibition, and looking in general like an unmade bed, I do not regard him as an individualist at all. I regard him as an exhibitionist who is trying to make some sort of sick point at the expense of other individuals who are not trying to do that. Therefore, I think I am consistent. I would not like anybody to start a Tower of Babel any place, because I think that would violate the right of other individuals who don't want him to do so. I want him to be an individualist here, not at the expense of others. Now we'll take two more. Yes, sir.
In your book, What They Are Doing to Your Children, you mention a method of teaching American history, or a philosophy, which would say that we should only teach the good things that happened in American history, because and I think I'm quoting you accurately, that the bad things only would tend to distort the picture. Now, if I'm going to be an individual examining American history, not by what I'm told, but by looking at things and deciding what I think is good and what is bad, how can I do this if I ignore the bad points?
You can't, of course. You're quite right. My thesis on this is simple. I think that American history should be taught exactly as history. I think everything that occurred should be taught insofar as you can squeeze it into a course. And I think it should be taught without commentary and without propaganda on either side. What I objected to, as I recall in the passage you mentioned, was the current practice of saying that every positive development in American history now has to be equally balanced by an equally prominent vice, no matter how deeply you may have to dredge and dig around to the bottom of the barrel to dredge up one of the latter. And it seems to me that this is a completely artificial and distorted view of American history. History, like anything else, should come naturally. It should be a flow of events. Of course, there are many bad things in American history, many evil things, and the schools certainly teach it. The evils of slavery certainly are made clear in every textbook. The evils of sweatshop labor and laissez-faire capitalism are certainly made clear in the books that have been adopted during the 1960s in the California junior and senior high schools. I know because I helped pick them out. And certainly the evils done to some of our racial minorities are increasingly being made clear in many states. I think there's a great improvement here. Insofar as improvement still needs to be made, I'm for it and will assist it, as I did for 10 years in California. But to say that you have to dramatize either end of it, this isn't true. Our grandparents in the Little Red Schoolhouse, for example, contrary to what you may believe, the teacher did not come to school every day, clad in Old Glory, firing off a Revolutionary War musket and whistling Columbia, the Gem of the Ocean. As a matter of fact, she had very little to say about patriotism or love of country. She took it for granted that out of the study of American history, the great scope and sweep and vista of it would spring a natural love of country. It was a process rather like growing up for those people. And as far as I'm concerned, the facts, naked and unadorned, were sufficient, and they would be sufficient for our grandchildren too, if we can just be sure that the great story continues to be told. But I do resent books, and I've seen those come across my desk, which stress so greatly the imperialism of this country around the turn of the century, and fail completely to mention that while we did take over the Philippines and Cuba for a while, we turned them back, unique, willingly, of all the major colonial powers in that day. They fail to mention that while many of the immigrants were badly treated, scorned, and sneered at here, none of them ever went home or wanted to. I like to have an equal balance. This has nothing to do with individualism or the subject of my talk, but it does have to do with accurate portrayal of facts. And in this, as a person who has worked with textbooks all his life, I think I do have some little expertise. I don't want a school book that teaches that Americans are all crosses between Sir Galahad and St. Francis of Assisi. But neither do I want a textbook to make Americans appear as though they were a cross between John Wilkes Booth and Simon Legree. Final question. Yes, ma'am.
Considering the fact of your viewpoint that the population is the greatest problem that we have now, and your view that we should educate people here and abroad, it seems to me that education, sex education, is not being taught in the home. And I would like your viewpoints of sex education as being taught in public schools.
She wants to know about sex education in the schools. Here, I can talk about something where I think California did a good job. There are many things that I don't think they did a good job in, but this isn't one of them. About 4 years ago, after a great series of investigations and studies, the California legislature passed a law which was classic in its simplicity and in its common sense. And it simply said something like this: people who have failed to give the principles of sex education to their children through their churches or their homes, who wish it given to those children in school by expert teachers teaching scientifically and objectively, should have it done, and it should be provided free of charge by the public schools. People who have religious or conscientious objections against it, who have done it themselves or in their churches, need not have their children exposed to it a second time. That law is on the books, and since it's been passed, there hasn't been one single hassle in California about sex education to my knowledge. Now, I'd like to conclude by congratulating you. There's some things I don't like about your generation. There's some things I don't like about my own. And there are many things I didn't like about my father's. But there's one thing, well, let's put it this way. Let's put the negative first. And I've noticed it as much on this campus as I have on others. You don't laugh much. You don't smile very much. If I had a parting word to you, it'd be cheer up. The world is not coming to an end. Tomorrow is going to be here. There's another curtain to go up. Cheer up. Be a little happier. Atomic Armageddon, ecological pollution, the H-bomb, they threaten all of us, not you. And yet, sad faces and morbid reflections will not arm you for the battle with the future. Joy may, although it may be difficult for you to drudge it up, there is still, regardless of what you think, much to be joyful about in this nation. And then the good thing. In my day, whole geologic eons ago, when I was an undergraduate of your age, the mere announcement that a dean of education was coming on campus to speak about problems of education would have sufficed to empty a hall like this in 37 seconds. You could have had the meeting in the broom closet with room left over for the brooms. It is greatly to your credit that you are interested enough voluntarily to be here and to listen to what has been, I think, a serious discussion. I applaud you for it. I congratulate you for it. In this, you are superior to my generation. Goodbye, and God bless you all.
Mr. Rafferty, could I make one suggestion? Julian Bond was here 2 days ago, and he made a point. How can we afford 3 days of peace, love, and music when there's a lifetime of misery in Watts?
Let's have anybody else who has any questions come up to the platform, and I will be glad to tackle them individually until they drag me away. Thank you for coming.
You have been listening to another in a series of lectures given on the campus of Iowa State University in Ames. Today you heard the question and answer period, which followed an address by author, columnist, and educator Max Rafferty. The program was recorded at this year's VISHA activities at Iowa State and is the third in a series of programs from that festival. University Lecture is a presentation of Iowa State University Radio.